Record.
Welcome in everyone. Welcome to Care Concierge with Care Patrol, where education is the heart of everything that we do. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's Labor Day, September 5th. I hope that those of you on the line are not working today. If you are, I appreciate you joining us, taking time from your busy workday holiday. I'm sure it is busy to join us. And those of you who are off work today, special thanks to you for tuning in. I hope that you're enjoying your Labor Day and it hasn't been rained out yet. Thank y'all so much for being here today. It's Care Concierge with Care Patrol, our monthly educational series, which takes place on Mondays and on most Fridays or most Mondays of each month. 6 times a month, we do education for our clinicians and partners, referral partners, in the same way that we choose to educate our clients. So everything that we do is based on educating our clients as to what is the best resource or resources for them. And likewise, we want to bring you resources that will enrich your professional lives or personal lives or both. So today with Care Concierge at Care Patrol, we're addressing the topic, and we'll address topics all week that deal with mental, or all month, excuse me, dealing with mental health. Today's topic is dealing with grief. And I thank you all for being here. Let's go through some of our housekeeping just as we get started and more people are joining us. Excuse me. We are accredited, as many of you know, by the Alabama Board of Social Work Examiners and by the Alabama Board of Nurse Practitioners. And they allow us to create and credential and offer you contact hours through them. Those of you who've been with us in past know that in the past we would mute your mics just for fear of having background noise, but I found that we enjoy the discussion so much more that I allow you all to unmute at any time during the presentation if you need to interrupt and ask a question or clarify a point or share an example that may be of benefit. And if you're not comfortable talking, you can always use the chat room. And if you're not familiar with reaching the chat room or your microphone in the Zoom app, take your cursor and run it up to the top of your screen, and a little black box should pop down. And if that's not the case, then run your cursor to the bottom of your screen, and a little black box will pop up. And on that little black box is a picture of a microphone. If you click that, it unmutes you. There's also a little tab that says chat. Click on that and you can open the chat room and join in the discussion. So that is an option for everyone. I hope you'll enjoy today's presentation and do enter into discussion with us. Our evaluations are due at 8 o'clock this evening. And I do that, I ask that of you so that I can get out the certificates to each of you. So everyone who participates today and completes an evaluation will receive a certificate, a contact hour, social workers and nurses and therapists alike. Now, if you're a nurse, we will post your hour onto the ABN website. If you're a social worker, you still have the right to do that for yourselves. So I know some of you participate by phone when you join us, and so I'm going to read for you the SurveyMonkey evaluation link. So again, to receive a certificate of participation and receive your hour, you must complete an evaluation. That evaluation can be reached at this address, https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/all uppercase letters, V as in victory, B as in ball, Z as in zoo, Z as in zoo, J, H, P as in Paul. I've also posted this in the chat room. If you've been able to pull that up, I'll read it one more time for those of you making note of it. It is https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/ all uppercase letters, V as in victory, B as in boy, Z as in zoo, Z as in zoo, J, H, P as in Paul. That is our Survey Monkey link today. And those of you who've been with us in the past know that our survey, our evaluation is password protected. And so we will give out the password today, later in today's presentation. And we do that to allow and to show the Board of Nursing and Board of Social Work that you were here, that it was live, that you participated and stayed long enough and were attentive enough to get the password and fill out the evaluation. This is the way in which we're able to offer this CE to you as a live CE or face-to-face CE. Now, it will be recorded, placed on my website and on YouTube under Sean Barnes Care Patrol channel. And you can, or have others watch this for credit, for recorded credit or at-home study credit. So these CEUs are free to you. We do ask you to do an evaluation, even if you do it online later. Let me know, send me an evaluation, or just let me know that you've done the evaluation and I'll send you your certificate for the recorded hour. So that is the housekeeping for today. One more time, I want to welcome everyone, those who joined us, to Care Concierge with Care Patrol, where education is the heart of everything that we do. Today's education is dealing with grief, and we will get started. Our objectives for today are to, one, and you'll be asked about these on the evaluation. One, briefly discuss, and this will be brief, y'all, and define grief. And that should be fairly straightforward. We all understand grief. We'll share the historical grief models, like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, for example, that's the most well known of all of the models. And we will learn two new models of grief and have approaching those who are grieving in order to offer some sort of support and respite for them. So those are objectives. We're talking about grief today with Care Concierge, with Care Patrol. And what we know is, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, in 2015, the United States leads the world in chronic diseases. The world. About half of all U.S. adults have one or more chronic health condition. And 86% of the healthcare dollars in the U.S. go toward the treatment of chronic diseases, which remain the leading cause of death and disability in our country. And as we would assume, many of our aging adults have not just one, but perhaps several chronic illnesses simultaneously. But we know that 1 in 4 adults have 2 or more chronic health conditions. And so, as you can see, we have an issue in this country with chronic diseases and the support of those who have chronic diseases. Now, whenever we have a serious health issue, we're forced to remake ourselves, to restructure our lives, to learn to adapt and to do things differently. We might be limited in the activities we can perform that we once performed with ease, or we may be restricted from certain things like foods or other things that are environmental that may be a problem for us. And we will certainly most likely experience just a lack of energy and a change in our future plans and roles within the family, not just for us, but for everyone within our family. And signs of grief that you may notice of someone who's been pronounced recently with a debilitating chronic illness. Signs of grief could be upon a follow-up visit that they have shown non-compliance with the physician order or the treatment plan or the medications that were prescribed. Now, we talked on Friday about medications and the fact that 50% of those with chronic diseases in the US do not fill their prescriptions 50% of the time. And so we see that grief and depression could be one of the reasons, in addition to cost, that folks don't comply with the physician order or prescription. It's because we may at that point take a defeatist mindset along the lines of, this is going to happen anyway. What can I do? Why should I care? Let's just let it happen. And these are all signs of, as you know, depression, and then lack of sleep and depression sort of form a storm, if you will, a perfect storm in which one feeds the other feeds the one, and our depression grows, as does our complete exhaustion and lack of sleep and proper rest. So guilt is going to be present in any of these, and in the stage of the person that you are speaking with, guilt will be one of the things that they combat and one of the things that leads to their depression. So we've identified 8 common life-altering events, and each of these would cause us to form and to face a new normal, simply because the old normal can no longer return and be. So the 8 most common life-altering events, and number 1 will be no surprise, is the death of a loved one. We'll discuss this in greater length today. We've discussed health issues. These all plague the caregiver in terms of financial instability, in the sense that there is not enough time, not enough resources, not enough strength, not enough sleep, not enough money, not enough whatever. It's the sense of lack that is brought about by the act of aging and death. And then there's the realization of aging. If we are caregivers of an aging adult with a chronic illness that requires our support, naturally, particularly if we're related to them, we will begin to face our own mortality and begin to have concerns about, what if this is my reality 20 or 30 years? And so the realization of aging can be quite disturbing for us, as will be the shift in family dynamics. So if the person who has become chronically ill and can no longer do the activities they once did with ease, then naturally there will be a shift in the family dynamic, because that role of being the fixer or the helper or the nurturer or whatever the role may be will have to be replaced by someone else acting in that role. And the person who placed or performed that role will then have to adapt to their new role. And in both cases, the caregiver as well as the care recipient and the family have a loss in their social circle because of the time attended to care for that person. So naturally, if they have issues in the morning and again at lunch and again in the afternoon, it leaves little time for us to call a friend or take a walk or go to lunch with the girlfriends as we've always done. So we lose our social circle. And about the only thing truly that is as disturbing as the death of a loved one is divorce. We've all heard that statistic that of the things that you can go through, moving and divorce are among the hardest, as well as losing one's job. So retiring, as you can imagine, you replace an entire life, if you will, of associations and geographical places and being out and about and around people. When all that ceases very quickly upon the date of retirement, then you naturally begin to have some of these above issues with the realization of your aging and the concern about financial stability and the loss of your social circle. And so all of these things can be life altering for us. All of them can induce in us a sense of guilt. And so what we see in each of the above eight and in grief in general is a common theme, which is fear of the unknown. And I would say that that fear defines in many ways the human condition, what we believe in and what we accept and what we tolerate are all based upon our fear of the unknown and the unknown itself. Aging, death, these are our great fears. They are unknown to us. So our common theme in grief and in really guilt in a sense is fear of the unknown. So if we're dealing with grief, we know that grief is a universal for all of us. We all experience and have experienced grief and will experience grief again. In fact, as we age, we may know grief at a much deeper level, as we know that grief is especially prevalent among the aging and also among the caregivers who care for the aging. The experience itself of aging is chock full of loss, loss of function, loss of role, loss of visibility in popular culture, loss of income, loss of friends, loss. But lest you think that loss is just the province of the care recipient, the caregiver is also awash in loss. They've lost the characteristics of their loved one that made them who they were, that was part of the family and social dynamics. The caregiver loses her freedom because she cannot leave the home with the infirmed spouse or brother or whomever the person may be. She loses her freedom. She is now on someone else's clock, so to speak. And because she loses the ability to get out into the world, she loses her social support. And so we see that grief touches both sides of the coin of caregiving, both the recipient and the caregiver. So I want to ask y'all, and I hope you'll unmic if you're or unmute rather, if you're comfortable. And if you're not, I understand this is something of a personal question, but have you experienced grief due to changes with aging, your own or someone else's? Have you experienced grief due to changes with aging your own or someone else's? If you're comfortable, please answer in the chat room or interrupt me. I'm happy to be interrupted for you to share your opinion. Please do. I see Ms. Keldon Jones has said, yes, I've experienced both grief in my own life with aging and grief at watching someone else age. So thank you so much for replying and interacting. I hope that if the others of y'all have not felt comfortable answering in the chat room, that you will someday, or that you will simply make notes silently about your own experience with grief as we move through today's education. So historically, theories of grief have focused or fixated on grieving a fixed loss. And the fixed loss clearly is when someone dies. But caregivers often experience loss little by little, day by day. And they're losing aspects of their own lives as well as aspects of their loved one, and at the same time processing once again their own immortality and the fear of the unknown that is attendant to that. And Ms. Cagle, you said you have experienced both, but especially with certain transitions in life. And I can understand that completely. And you younger folks on the line, unfortunately, will begin to know, I believe, what Ms. Cagle and I know, which is that with certain milestone birthdays, you do look at what you could once do and can no longer do with ease. And while it may seem immaterial and not important, I cannot get off the floor anymore with just popping up. I have to support myself, put my hand on my knee, put my hand on a chair and press up. And while that may seem like a nominal thing, it's a nagging thing. It's a thing that involves daily life and function. And to see that ability disappear does cause concern about what other functional motor skills might I lose over time. And you may have had something serious and something similar, rather. There's increasing evidence that the losses in function and that the loss of role and that other aspects that make us persons and our relationships during the caregiving process, that these losses for the caregiver, that these losses in the relationship for the caregiver begin their grieving process, prolong their grieving process, and complicate their grieving process because there is little bits of guilt and grief almost daily. And so to process those requires a real sense of mindfulness. And by mindfulness, we mean simply being in the present. So there was a pioneer psychiatrist, psychologist by the name of Edward John Mostyn Bowlby. That's quite the name, isn't it? British, as you would guess, and who examined the process of mourning in 1961. He also was well known for his work with attachment theory, which is more in the early stages of life upon birth and early childhood. And so he was something of a dynamic person who addressed attachment and grief in two different sets of populations. Bowlby defined grief or mourning as having stages, 4 stages to be precise. And each of these stages has a characteristic symptom with the stage. And it also has a consequence for the person who is grieving if they're not able to work through the stage of grieving that we are in, that we move or should move seamlessly through. The first stage, according to Bowlby, is shock and numbness. And I think that would be what I would think would be the first sense of death or the grieving of any great loss, is the shock and the numbness of it, where you wake up and you think, can this be real? This isn't happening. I can't believe that I'm having to relive this horrible thing upon waking. And the symptoms of this stage are fatigue and loss of sleep. And so you can begin to see that loss of sleep, fatigue, and grief are working in tandem against us moving forward. And if we're not able to move forward through the shock and numbness stage, then we are not going to be able to accept the loss. And we're going to shut down emotionally. And we may remain shut down for quite some time, if not the remainder of our lives. And Ms. Cagle, you made another comment. I want to read it. The grief process in caring for my grandfather with Alzheimer's and dementia was a very different process because of the prolonged process and adjusting along the way. We talked about caregiver resilience, I believe, some time ago, and it's shocking, but if you are aware of it, the average caregiver spends about 8 hours or less per day with their care recipient, or 8 hours a week, excuse me. Whereas the person caring for someone with dementia, on average, spends 84 hours a week caring for a loved one. That's 2 full-time jobs. So you can imagine the things that we've talked about as plaguing the caregiver, particularly caregivers who are in Ms. Cagle's situation, is that we are working so much, there is no time for self. And so all of those ideas that we discuss, such as the loss of a social circle, the loss of support, the loss of freedom, that's clear to see if you're working 84 hours a week caring for someone. The average caregiver, so that you know, is a 46-year-old woman who spends 20 hours a week caring for her mother. The woman is married or has a life partner. It's possible that she may have children, so that she is fully enveloped in what we call the sandwich generation, caring for those who are younger in age and need support, and caring for those who are older and aging and need support. And so the caregiver who upon death cannot move past shock and numbness will shut down. The other stages in Bowlby's model of grief, stage 2 is yearning and searching. And this is where you begin to actually feel the loss. You move past the numbness and you begin to feel acutely the loss of life. And you begin to search for something to fill that void or provide comfort. And that could be any of a number of healthy things, or it could be any of a number of maladaptive coping mechanisms. But should it be those that are positive in nature and life-affirming and self-affirming, then the people who move through that will not feel the phase of possibly years trying to compensate for the loss of their loved one, trying to fill the hole. Number 3 is despair and disorganization. So we have shock and numbness, yearning and searching, and then we move from yearning and searching into despair. and disorganization, where we finally come to accept the loss in its finality. And we begin to feel or experience despair, which can border on hopelessness and can cause us to ask, will this ever get any better? Am I ever going to feel better? Am I ever going to recover and return to the way I felt before? And those who are unable to get through this and process this are going to continue, in all likelihood, to feel despair. And that despair will lead to anger. And as you may know, anger turned inward is depression. And so as we grow in our despair and our anger, naturally we are feeding our depression. And it is likely that through these negative emotions, we will adopt and adapt to a negative outlook upon life, which will seriously change the course of our path. And lastly, if we moved through shock and numbness, yearning and searching, despair and disorganization, we enter in Bowlby's mind reorganization and recovery. And this is where we've accepted the loss. We've come to move through our despair, and we begin to look outside ourselves and our surroundings to establish a new. We establish even possibly new beliefs about life and our place in the world. And this is characterized by the acceptance that we have for death and grieving, and for our need to heal ourselves and rebuild and refocus our thoughts on our own emotions and our own experiences, rather than the grief of a past event, however traumatic. So Bowlby, the pioneer, gave rise to Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, the pioneer, who built on Bowlby's thinking from 1961, and in 1969 published her stages of grief. And they are similar to, yet different from Bowlby. In her, Kubler-Ross's first stage, there is denial, or denying or ignoring death when it's imminent. And this really can apply both to the caregiver, who might be denying that their loved one is terminally ill, or it could be the care recipient who refuses to accept the diagnosis. So denial is the first stage in Elisabeth Kubler-Ross's sense of the stages of dying. And it is because your mind tries to stay in a powerful position, even though it is undermined, forgive the pun, by the disease and the disability. So the next thing after we move through this denial of our situation is that we become angry at the situation. We may be angry at life, angry at ourselves for choices we made in life, or even angry at God for placing this sudden change and disability squarely in our path. But anger is our obstacle, and it is a common reaction of the physiological body to use anger when it is in these situations. So denial and anger give way to the next stage in Kubler-Ross's modes or stages of grieving, which is bargaining. So once you accept that your anger will not cause the disease or disability or diagnosis to change or go away, then we move into bargaining. And we start saying, well, if I only do this, will you make Dad healthy? If I can do this, will you help mom's memory? If I can do that, what will you do? But the odd thing is that when we move into a bargaining stage in which we are attempting to negotiate with fate, rather than becoming more active, we become more docile. And so if you see someone who's presenting to you and you know they're somewhere in the grieving stage and they appear passive, then it's likely that they're at the bargaining stage of their journey, which will give way to depression. Depression is the fourth stage in Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And this occurs when the reality is inescapable, when we realize that nothing is going to change this diagnosis or disability or life-altering event, and we naturally at that point feel powerless and hopeless. And the only maybe saving grace of this is that in our passivity, we're saving our energy perhaps for other better uses. And then lastly, in Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, we come upon acceptance. And this is where you are neutral. There has been a life-altering event in your life, and yet you are not chained to it. You are neutral about it. Yes, this happened. It wasn't good. It wasn't bad. It just was. I made it through. And the acceptance begins to internalize the situation that you're in and everything that's happened to date, and allows one to then look toward the future, which in Bowlby's mind was to begin to plan for the future and turn your thoughts from someone else to your own ability. And you may even at that time begin to positively reinterpret that loss and think about it from the perspective of what it did for your family or for you, that dad didn't linger or that mom's suffering was ended. So all of these stages of grief, the historical stages of grief, are linear. You move from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and then Kubler-Ross to 5. They're linear progressions. You don't get to the second one until you've completed the first. Each of these stages of grief are named such that you understand by the name what that grief stage is and appears to be. And each of them have consequences. If you don't move through that stage to the next stage, where will you be? Will you be stuck, and where will you be stuck? Now, they have been, Kubler-Ross's and other folks who worked since then have added 2 stages to her model, which is an initial shock phase. So the first phase would be initial shock. The second phase would be numbness. And then she has a testing phase before the acceptance. So you would begin to test your boundaries and test your reality and test to see if the world is the way you perceive it, even though it's been interrupted now by this caregiving journey that you've been on. And so we came across this a priest, French, who's now deceased, who was active in the 1940s, and an author of a book I would encourage you to look at called The Art of Thinking. And I think it will enliven you to read. But what Ernest Dumais said was the happiness of most people is not ruined by great catastrophes or fatal errors, but by the repetition of slowly destructive little things. And so I want to ask you, what do you think is meant by that? What do you think is meant by the happiness of most people is not ruined by great catastrophes or fatal errors, but by the repetition of slowly destructive little things? Does anyone have a thought on what that might mean? And not in the general sense, but in the sense of where we've been talking about caregivers and caregiving. What little thing might be destructive over time with repetition? Would it be, for example, my inability to get off the floor by myself without great effort, even though I've lost weight? So would it be those little things that add up? Keldon Jones says ruminating is harmful, and I would agree that whenever you rehash and relive the past, which you cannot change, you are robbing yourself of the present, which you can change. Ms. Tyus says that what is meant by the happiness of most people is not ruined by catastrophes or fatal errors, but by the repetition of slowly destructive little things. It is a buildup. That's exactly right. It is a buildup of things happening that slowly take our spirits. It's not the great disease diagnosis. It's the having to re-explain the remote over and over and over to your mother. And so caregiving has not been historically conceptualized as an ongoing grief process, but research shows that what we used to associate as fatigue is really more consistent with grief. If you look at how Bowlby and Kubler-Ross conceptualized it, and how each of them talked about fatigue as being a telltale sign of what was happening with their loved one. Ms. Cagle says day in and day out, witnessing little losses or little things that a loved one could do fade just a little each day. That's heartbreaking. It is grief. And it's why we grieve. And caregivers often express significant negative thoughts. And you can imagine, if you're living the reality Ms. Cagle lived, watching someone slip away, you can have many negative thoughts, emotions, and even physiological changes and responses to the body: regret, guilt, despair, anger, loneliness, loss of roles, fatigue, crying, agitation, cognitive dysfunction, and the sense that things are unreal was the day in the life of the caregiver. Theirs is the grief we need to heal, in addition to the care recipient. Some caregivers get what's called stress response syndrome, sometimes called adjustment disorder or situational depression. And it occurs with these life-altering events when they enter our lives. The DSM-V, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, estimated that 5 to 21% of psychiatric patients are diagnosed as having stress response syndrome, not depression. Adult women diagnosed twice as often as adult men. 75% of the caregiving done in the US is done by women. The main symptoms of these adjustment disorders are disturbance in our conduct, disturbance in our emotions and our conduct, depressed moods, Anxiety and depression and anxiety typically go hand in hand, and then a mix of those as we've seen. So those are the symptoms of adjustment disorder. And according to WebMD, these symptoms usually begin about 3 months after the life-altering event, and they rarely last longer than 6 months after the event. But unlike depression, it can be resolved. Stress response syndrome can be resolved if we can adapt and make changes. And this is why we're discussing this topic. So there are new developments in the field of healthy coping with caregiving and grief and caregiver support. We've talked about these in other CEUs. And so there's similarly new models of grief being developed for caregivers that we want to use to intervene in their experience and make a positive difference in their lives, both pre-death of the care recipient and post-death. The two of the models that have been put forth that are new are called, one, the relief model, and two, the complicated model. And Ms. Cagle says fatigue causes major guilt on the caregiver, and it does. And studies show that. In fact, I've read that many times. The relief model that we mentioned, one of the two new models of addressing and coping with grief, the relief model focuses on the resolution of stress that's going to result from the eventual death of the recipient of care. And when we intervene in the life of this caregiver with the relief model in mind, we're able then to incorporate a longer trajectory of care and a longer period in which the caregiver has time to adapt and move through these stages and to adapt to the change in role and the change in loss and the change in freedom and the change in responsibility. Caregivers who experience this kind of relief in the midst of caregiving find that they often are able to resume their prior activity or role with some adjustment. And then to Ms. Cagle's point, there's a struggle with guilt, anticipating the loved one's death, and with guilt at one's fatigue at feeling that one is not the optimal caregiver for the care recipient. And so guilt and grief are the two G's that will take us down. The complicated model demonstrates how elevated levels of stress with caregiving can become more complex after the death of the care receiver. And this is because there's a failure on the part of the caregiver because we did not do the intervention. There's a failure on the part of the caregiver to acknowledge the losses that are happening on a daily basis. The losses incurred, those are mounting and they're being shoved down and shoved back and put in another place for safekeeping. And the box over time that they're placed in begins to fill and begins to overfill and begins to run over and into the life of the caregiver. And once their care recipient dies, the box opens and then there's real trouble. Caregivers have great difficulty finding closure and resolving grief when they integrate into life or reintegrate. But this is because they often struggle as caregivers. They struggle with the role for whatever reason. Perhaps they feel they're not trained to provide care. Perhaps they are not emotionally connected with the person for whom they are tasked with providing care. Perhaps they had other disturbances in their own lives that didn't allow them to be fully attentive. Whatever the reason, guilt is a common, not ally, but adversary to caregiving. And then when we see that both models have difficulty and present and just, show us the difficulties in processing the experience of caregiving and the loss attendant to it, we see that we can affect their grief by how we approach them in the midst of their caregiving act. So if we can impact them while the care recipient is alive, we can have them address their guilt and their shame and their grief while alive, will be better suited, and they'll be better suited to address the same when their care recipient dies. So if we're going to assess someone for grief who's in the midst of caregiving, we want to take a holistic approach. We want to look at the biological factors that are present. Do they appear, or do they admit that they are fatigued? Do they suggest that they have had trouble sleeping, staying asleep, or falling asleep? Or, with my mother, with caring for my stepfather, he was up every 2 hours, and naturally she was up every 2 hours for 4 years. And it took a huge toll on her physically, cognitively, and on her social circle. And so we want to look then at the social changes that are occurring in the lives of the caregiver that we're talking with. Have there been changes in the family dynamic? For example, did the care recipient always pay the bills, and now it's the role of the caregiver, and that's overwhelming? And then we want to look at their psychological appearance. Do they seem to be sad? Are they exhibiting anxiety? What emotional or psychological issues might be present when we interview them. And then lastly, we want to talk about the spiritual nature of death, and the death experience is a normal part of life, and it's a normal part of experience, so that we can again begin to give them some relief and some support. And so you want to ask these questions, and you want to prompt answers. We talked, I believe, about help with medication cost on Friday, and one of the barriers to patients taking medication is cost, but it would also be that they would not feel comfortable saying so. And so it's incumbent on us to ask the question, did you have trouble affording your medications? Or in this case, are you having trouble sleeping? How is your energy level? Questions of those nature. So we all experience grief and stress differently. So we have to keep an eye out as we're interviewing and prompting for answers from our clients or patients. But what we know is that if we do this for them, if we ask those questions that may be uncomfortable and we prompt for answers that may be uncomfortable, what we are doing, in fact, is allowing this caregiver to state her thoughts, her feelings, and her physical sensations, her physical body, her health out loud to someone else. And this can be profoundly impactful as an intervention psychologically, because it begins to normalize the experience and let the caregiver know that neither she nor the care recipient are alone. There is a community of people who have the same issue and are going through the same emotions. And so what we talked about earlier was that all of this sense of a impactful intervention moves us from ruminating on the past, as Keldon Jones had pointed out, and it focuses us on the present, the here and now. And when we are focused on the present, on the here and now, we are able then to cope and accept and adapt and move forward through the present and into the future moments, which are the future present. So we need to provide that simple intervention for our clients. So let me ask y'all, do you encounter people who are grieving in your work life? Do you have patients or clients who come to you who you know to be or expect to be in the process of grieving? And if so, what, if anything, can you or do you do for them? So again, if you're comfortable with the unmuting, we'd love to hear what you have to say. If you're more comfortable using the chat room, please do so. I'd love to know if grief and people who are grieving is something that you encounter in your daily work life. And if it is, how you address it, what you might do for those folks who are in need. And so when we're dealing with grief, Jennifer Thomas says, really just letting them vent seems to help. And that's exactly what we just said, Jennifer. I'm glad you corroborated that experience. There are many ways to comfort someone grieving. Keldon Jones says, if it's a friend, just random text, cards, meals, and just listen. That's it. It's listen. It's listen. It's listen. Many ways to comfort someone grieving. We can educate, first of all, the caregivers on grief. We could talk about the stages of grief, as according to Kubler-Ross, for example, and let them know what to look for and what is in front of them and how it is a normal response to loss, not just death, but loss. Ms. Jones, Ariel Jones says, I'm a discharge planner at a hospital, so I just do my best to provide support, empathy, and any resources I can think of. Perfect. Thank you for doing what you do. I appreciate you. We can discuss with our caregivers how grief is an ongoing process and that it will contain shock and anger, sadness and confusion. It will cause despair and guilt. It will cause us to be docile. But one of the beneficial aspects of us educating them, again, is that it normalizes grief and the grief of loss and the grief of death. And it allows them to say or to see that a lot of education, a lot of research, a lot of understanding has been applied to grief and grieving. Therefore, it must be a topic of some importance to many, many people. We can never underestimate what it's like to help someone feel not alone. And so when people have difficulty in grief, as we've discussed, it's usually because they get stuck. And when we educate, we help them to unstick themselves. And in addition to fostering a process of unsticking, as we've discussed, we also want to share resources, as Ariel Jones does, with our clients and let them know about local groups that may provide group therapy or any sort of counseling, or just letting them know that there are other people in their situation. And so with grief, responding is not just those who are in pastoral care, it is all of us. Caregivers will open up to you as clinicians, probably more than they will to a friend. So do prompt them. And then having knowledge of grief is going to help you serve your clients. Courtney Shepherd Brown says that working in long-term care, I witness people grieving the loss of their independence out in the community. I encourage them to express their thoughts and feelings, encourage family to visit often, and try to find ways they can continue activities of interest that they did before. admission to the nursing home. I love you, Courtney Shepherd Brown. You're great. And you're doing great things for the people that are in your care. And I thank you. Every professional, every one of you is able to be the bridge to caregiving relief in terms of guilt and grief. And Ms. Jones, you did not. Thank you for keeping me on track. The code word today, we hit our hour. I apologize for running over. The code word today is listen with a capital L. Capital L-I-S-T-E-N. Listen. I'm putting the Survey Monkey link back up in the chat room for those of you who can see it. And I want to move on to one last thing, which I hope will assist us as we move through the rest of our day. And that is this. It is the Serenity Prayer. You may all know it. If you choose to say it with me, good on you. If not, let it heal you today and moving forward. It is, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So when we are approaching grief or approaching situations that seem overwhelming, God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm sorry I kept you over. The CEU code word is listen with a capital L. Please complete your evaluation by tonight at 8 o'clock so I can get our certificates out. Every one of you who does an evaluation will receive a certificate. Nursing hours will be uploaded for you. And we thank you for listening to Care Concierge with Care Patrol, where education is the heart of everything that we do. And we appreciate your referrals and allowing us to educate and calm and nurture folks who are in need. Thank you so much. I hope you have a terrific rest of your Labor Day. And I hope that I see you on Friday when we discuss mindfulness interventions for depression and anxiety. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you have a great rest of your holiday and stay dry. Well, it didn't work, y'all. One more time.